At one point or another, us RPG fanatics needed some training wheels. At least that's what Squaresoft thought, as they mocked up the idea for an entry-level role-playing game that would become known as Final Fantasy Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo. This game was specifically targeted for a more novice North American audience when it came to console RPGs. Thus, it was first released there in 1992, in a bid to expand the console RPG market. Later on in 1993, they would release it in Japan as Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest, as well as in Europe, simply titled Mystic Quest Legend. I know, Final Fantasy really did some naming gymnastics back in the early 90s. Now, just because this game was made to be an easier, more straightforward RPG experience, does that necessarily mean it's bad? The setting of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest takes place in an unnamed continent that consists of 4 distinct regions that each rely on the power of elemental crystals, with a tower in the very middle acting as a mediary for them all. One day, that tower is attacked by powerful monsters who steal the crystals and keys to the tower, spreading out across the land. These monsters are feeding off the power of the crystals, and thus siphoning the life force away from the land. An old prophecy told of these events, and that a knight would rise up to defeat the monsters and return the continent back to its former glory. The player steps into the role of said knight, who has just witnessed his town destroyed by an earthquake, and then is guided by a mysterious old man who charges him with the knight's prophecy. The default character name is Benjamin, but you can enter a different name at the beginning of the game if you want. With the intent of keeping the story more straightforward, Benjamin's journey unfolds through a series of near-automated events with clear-cut goals laid out in front of the player. The overworld makes sure you keep on track, as it's not a free-moving map. Rather, you are taken from point of interest to point of interest along a preset path, very similar to maps like Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World, for example. The overworld does hold a bit more than just traversing though, as they also hold locations called battlefields, where you have the chance to earn loot, gear, and spells after clearing out 10 battles in these locations. It really felt like side questing without actually having to search for anything. You play mainly as Benjamin, but he will often be accompanied by a single guest party member that changes as the story unfolds, with you meeting new people, and said people later needing to leave your side for various reasons. By default, the guest is set to automatically act, leaving the player to only worry about Benjamin's actions. However, if you wanted to have more control over the party, there was a setting to turn them to manual control and play more like a standard JRPG. Very often would these allies start out stronger than Benjamin, but as you journey with them, you will level up through standard RPG-style turn-based combat, gaining experience points for felling monsters. Unlike many JRPGs of the time, Mystic Quest actually showed where enemy encounters would occur, and you could almost completely avoid them if you wanted, as they did not move around at all. This allowed the developers to use this in puzzles and as guards for chests. But don't worry, grinders, all enemy encounters reset once you head out to the overworld. Speaking of resetting, I found it interesting to see that standard chests would all reset once you exit a location and return, whether it be dungeons or towns. These chests only held items like potions or ammunition to help restock what you're using. There were also red chests that housed more important items like gear or key items. Those would only be a one-time thing and just disappeared when you did the old leave and come back. When you find new gear and weapons, they automatically are equipped and upgraded, so asset management is taken out of the player's hands here, which is fine since all gear have simple progression without any crazy stat swaps or affinities to them. What you do have control over though is what type of weapon you're wielding that have different effects both in combat and on the overworld. You can change them on the fly using the L and R shoulder buttons, even in combat too. While in combat, the sword is a standard attack. The axe is a slightly stronger attack that does even more damage to tree, crab, turtle, and worm-type enemies. The claw having weaker damage, but also adds a chance of causing status effects to the target. And the bomb, which spreads damage across an enemy party. Outside of combat, along with being able to jump, the weapons are used to aid in solving puzzles and traversing dungeons. The sword can reach levers across gaps, the axe can chop down trees, the claw lets you climb some walls and later becomes a grappling hook, and the bomb that lets you blast open secret passages. Along with standard attacks, you also have access to items and magic. Usable items are all mainly restoratives, and magic is split into 3 categories: white, black, and wizard magic. Mystic Quest doesn't use MP, rather it allows you a set number of uses for each category that grows as you level up. White magic is purely restorative spells, black magic are offensive elemental spells, and wizard magic are higher level offensive spells that you typically will have much less use compared to black magic. Spells are not innately learned, rather, you have to discover them in chests, in stores, or even some earned from clearing those overworld battlefields. Now, all this hand-holding gameplay may make a seasoned veteran of RPGs cringe a little, but keep in mind that this game was specifically made to be an entry-level game into the genre. The game actually does a great job of teaching through doing, with consequences of failure still present, but not nearly as harsh. The game even lets you save anywhere at just about any time outside of combat, so newbies won't get frustrated at having to traverse back to where you got your butt handed to you. You won't be entirely off the hook though, as there is a slight penalty to Benjamin's stats for being defeated, but only temporarily. So, keeping in mind that this is a game from 1992, but it still felt like the walking speed could have been bumped up a few notches, especially since they were trying to promote exploring the dungeons by allowing players to see and avoid combat. There's just a lot of walking, and Benjamin moved a bit too sluggish for my liking. On top of that, while it was nice to have the shoulder buttons swap his weapons on the fly, you'd still have to stop moving for the button presses to register, so that really killed the momentum at times. Interactions did feel a bit clunky at times too, but not terribly so. Those NPCs though, need to learn to get out of the way. While the game did start off a bit patronizing, pretty soon I found myself engrossed enough in the gameplay that I actually recorded 2 hours of gameplay even though I was only targeting 1. It can still be entertaining to a veteran, you just need to approach it knowing the intent of the game. The gameplay of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest gets a 7 out of 10. A simplified RPG also got simplified graphics. Benjamin's sprite had a walk cycle, a few sprites for weapon use, and maybe 3 expression cycles at most. The story and gameplay weren't very deep, so that's all they really needed. It was nice to see that they showed updated weapon models whenever you got an upgrade, both in and out of combat. The guest characters were almost all just walk cycles, and since the combat was over-the-shoulder perspective, they literally just walk up, an animation plays on top of the enemy, then they step back. Is that so terrible? Not really, as it still gets the job done. The animation of monster icons on the map only have 2 poses, but at least they aren't just one generic monster icon. They at least look like the contents of their combat. Another nice touch that you don't often see in these classic RPGs though, is that while the monsters are just a static drawing that don't move in combat, they do actually degrade visually over time as you whittle away their HP. Some have maybe only 2 stages, while others had up to 5, mostly bosses, since they had more health. This was likely implemented in favor of a health bar to let the player know that they are making progress in beating down the opponent. Speaking of health bars, Mystic Quest also marks the first time you see a health bar in a Final Fantasy game. Surprising, right? There's 40 notches, each indicating 1 HP each. As Benjamin levels up, he gains 40 more HP each time, and it adds a sub-bar below it, indicating containers of 40 HP each. Once again, it was likely implemented to make visual representation of health that wasn't just numbers based. It also looks like it was set up in a way to train the newbies to keep on top of their health without too much penalty for failing to do so. It was a bit confusing to look at, but the game also allowed you to change a setting that displayed numbers instead of the bar if you wanted. Backgrounds were okay, nothing spectacular, but they did the job and portrayed exactly what they needed to. Towns were laid out very simple, even compared to older games like Final Fantasy I. They did still have a few hidden passages and secrets, but nothing difficult to figure out. Battle backgrounds were just plain simple fields of combat, and some environment in the upper quarter of the screen. There was one in an early Battlefield icon that had distant mountains and clouds moving at an epic speed. It was a smart use of animation to add the epicness, even with simplified design. Something I wish they had done away with, or at least refined though, was the screen flash when you attack with a sword or an axe. I get that it's there to highlight an epic attack, sure, but its flash rate was way too quick, and honestly probably epilepsy-inducing too. Even the bomb attack doesn't flash the screen, so really, it feels like there was no actual need to put that in. Early on, the overall color scheme of the game will feel drab and desaturated, like even as low as Final Fantasy VI levels. But keep in mind that the world is dying, and the color palettes reflect that. When Benjamin does manage to release crystals from monsters' grasps, both the overworld map and town's colors become bright and vibrant. Yet another simple way to highlight an RPG story. The graphics get a 7 out of 10. Considering the entry-level nature of Mystic Quest, it was surprising to hear the high quality of the music. The whole soundtrack seemed to make use of the entirety of the Super Nintendo sound chip. Towns made use of the organ sound to evoke calmness, while some dungeons used violins to feel a sense of fear and uncertainty. The overworld and another dungeon layered on the trumpets for epic adventure sound, and the combat threw down some epic guitar riffs that would actually go on to be some of the more memorable Final Fantasy songs of yore. In fact, it was the boss battle music that led me to finding this game in the first place, but more on that later. The sound effects, on the other hand, while not terrible, did leave room for improvement. Almost all of them sounded like they belonged on an 8-bit machine, even though the game was on a 16-bit platform. They really don't present too well, but thankfully the gameplay is engaging enough to have them drown out into the background. The music and sound gets an 8 out of 10. Even though I lived in this game's primary focus region, RPGs were still too daunting for me. Honestly, I don't even remember if I saw this game box anywhere. As I mentioned before, it was the boss battle music that led me to find Mystic Quest, but that wasn't until as late as the year 2000. Back then, there were archives of MIDI music of past games that were easily accessible for listening. It was around this time too that I was discovering more and more about Final Fantasy's past, so when I eventually took a listen to what Mystic Quest had to offer, I was amazed. How amazed, you ask? Well, I was messing around with RPG Maker 2000, and I made the decision to take Mystic Quest's boss battle music and make it my standard combat song. I loved it that much, even before playing the game itself. Of course, there came a time where I eventually got my hands on it and tried it out. I unfortunately fell into the trap of, what kind of baby game is this? And shortly just dropped it. For shame, Tony of the past. Looking back on it now, I think I could have enjoyed this game if I could have just got over how patronizing it seemed. Like I was some kind of RPG veteran or something. Sheesh. The nostalgia hit of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest gets a 7 out of 10. Squaresoft's attempt to bring mainstream North American popularity to console RPGs unfortunately fell quite short of the goal, only managing to sell 800,000 copies total worldwide, while non-RPG games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Street Fighter 2 were pulling multi-million copy sales. What it did manage to do, however, was carve out a place in history as being the easiest RPG on the Super Nintendo and in the Final Fantasy franchise. This can be looked at both positively and negatively, depending on what you're expecting out of the game. RPG veterans may scoff at Final Fantasy Mystic Quest due to its simplistic gameplay, story, and visuals, but when you take into consideration that it was intended to be an entry-level console RPG, it's not a bad game. In fact, all put together, it actually scores in and around the top 100 Super Nintendo games of all time. We all need to start somewhere after all.